In 1965, as tens of thousands of American troops poured into South Vietnam, expecting to overwhelm a lightly armed insurgency with firepower and mobility, a different kind of war was already underway in the south of the country, one that no amount of air power could easily touch. The new arrivals had been promised that helicopters, jets, and heavy artillery would make short work of the Viet Cong. In the Mekong Delta, those advantages counted for far less than anyone in Washington or Saigon expected. The fighting there would not be decided in the air or along the highways, because there were almost no highways. It would be decided on the water, and the water almost entirely belonged to the enemy. The Delta was unlike anywhere else the United States fought in Vietnam. Designated the 4th Corps Tactical Zone, it was a flat expanse of rice paddy, mangrove, and swamp, threaded by thousands of kilometers of rivers, canals, and tidal streams, much of it impassable to anything larger than a sampan. Roughly half of South Vietnam's population lived there, and the region produced most of the country's rice. Whoever controlled the waterways controlled the movement of food, weapons, and men across the entire southern third of the nation. By the mid-1960s, the Viet Cong understood this far better than the Americans did. They taxed the rivers, ferried supplies along them at night, and vanished into the vegetation after every contact. The US Navy had spent decades preparing to fight on the open ocean. It now had to learn more or less from scratch how to fight in water the color of mud, within arm's reach of a shoreline that could erupt in fire without warning. The men who fought there called it the Brownwater Navy, to distinguish it from the Blue Water Fleet operating offshore. The name stuck because it was exactly accurate. This is the story of an institution learning a kind of warfare it had no manual for, under conditions that punished nearly every assumption it carried in with it. To understand why the Riverine campaign took the shape it did and why it cost what it cost, the place to begin is not with the boats but with the problem they were built to solve. The strategic problem was clear by 1965, even if the solution was not. The South Vietnamese government's writ ran thin across much of the Delta, and in many districts it did not run at all once the sun went down. American and South Vietnamese commanders recognized that conventional sweeps through the paddies achieved very little when the enemy could simply slip across a canal that ground troops had no means of crossing. Infantry could walk into a hamlet, find nothing, and walk out, while the men they were hunting watched from the far bank or from beneath the surface of the water itself. The waterways were not an obstacle to the war. They were the medium of the war, the enemy's road network, his supply line, and his avenue of escape, and they were held by the other side. Whatever the United States intended to do in the Delta, it would first have to contest the water. And to contest the water it needed boats it did not yet have, crewed by men trained for a mission that did not yet exist. 2 missions emerged from this recognition. The first was interdiction, cutting the flow of supplies and personnel into the Delta from the sea and along the inland rivers. The second was projection, putting combat troops into areas that had been effectively closed to the government for years. These 2 needs generated the 3 foundational programs of the Riverine War. Coastal interdiction became Operation Market Time. Inland Patrol became Operation Game Warden. Combined Army and Navy Assault became the Mobile Riverine Force. Each was a direct response to a specific failure of the existing approach, and each had to invent its own tactics in the field. This, though, is harder than it sounds when the institution attempting it has no doctrine to fall back on, no body of experience to draw from, and an enemy already expert in the very environment the Americans were only beginning to understand. The seaborne problem came into focus first, and dramatically. In February 1965, a steel-hulled trawler was discovered grounded and burning in Vung Ro Bay on the central coast, its hold packed with tons of weapons and ammunition. The Vung Ro incident demonstrated that maritime infiltration was not a minor irritant, but a central artery of enemy resupply, with a substantial share of Viet Cong arms arriving by sea, carried down the coast in vessels disguised as ordinary fishing junks. The discovery forced a reassessment. If the enemy was moving war material in this quantity by water, then the long, porous coastline was not a flank to be guarded lightly, but a front in its own right. The Navy's response was Operation Market Time, formerly Task Force 115, a patrol barrier stretching the entire 200-mile coast of South Vietnam. The concept layered 3 lines of defense. Far offshore, destroyer escorts and patrol aircraft watched for trawlers attempting the long run down from the north. Closer in, a fleet of fast, shallow draft craft patrolled the coastal waters where the larger ships could not safely go. The inshore work fell largely to a new boat, the patrol craft Fast, known universally as the Swift boat, an aluminium-hulled vessel adapted, improbably, from a commercial design built to ferry crews to offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. It was never intended for combat. It was fast, lightly built, and available, and in 1965 availability counted for a great deal. The Swift boat was commanded by a junior officer and crewed by 5 or 6 men, mounting twin 50-caliber machine guns in a turret above the pilothouse and a combination mortar and machine gun aft. Market time worked, and it worked in a way that much of the war did not. Within roughly 2 years, the seaborne infiltration that had once supplied a large fraction of the enemy's needs had been reduced to a trickle, forcing the Viet Cong onto the longer and far costlier overland route through Cambodia and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It is worth dwelling on this because operational successes that could actually be measured were rare in this war. The trawlers could be counted. The interceptions could be verified. The trend line moved in the direction the Navy wanted it to move. The inland war, by contrast, would offer almost no such clarity, and the contrast between the two is itself one of the more instructive features of the Riverine campaign. The inland counterpart was Operation Game Warden, Task Force 116, established in December 1965, and it faced a far harder problem than its coastal cousin. Its job was to patrol the major rivers and the bewildering maze of smaller waterways, deny their use to the enemy, and support operations against the Viet Cong infrastructure embedded in the riverside hamlets. The coastline was at least a line that could be drawn on a chart. The interior was a web of branching channels with no edges at all, and the enemy was not running a recognizable cargo down it, but blending into the ordinary traffic of a populated agricultural region. The principal tool for this work was the river patrol boat, the PBR, a 31-foot fiberglass craft driven by water jets rather than propellers. The jets were the key to the whole design. They let the boat run in shallow, weed-choked water that would have fouled a conventional screw, draw only a couple of feet, and reverse thrust to stop or change direction almost instantly. It made better than 25 knots, carried twin 50-caliber machine guns in a forward tub, a single 50 aft, and additional automatic weapons along the sides, and it was crewed by 4 men. It was fast and nimble, and crucially almost completely unarmored. The fiberglass hull that made it light enough to perform also offered its crew virtually no protection. That single quality would define the experience of nearly everyone who served aboard one. The Delta itself shaped every engagement, and its conditions deserve to be stated concretely because they are the difference between understanding this campaign and merely reading about it. The terrain was a patchwork of cultivated paddy, dense nipa palm, and mangrove. Vegetation crowded the banks of the narrow canal so tightly that a patrol boat could pass within a few meters of a concealed firing position and never see it until the position opened fire. The tidal range altered the navigable depth of the waterways by the hour, opening some channels and closing others. Sandbars shifted from week to week. The heat and humidity were relentless, and the water itself carried disease. Visibility on the smaller streams could be measured in meters, and the nearest substantial support was frequently far away, beyond the reach of anything but a radio call. The enemy, as everywhere in Vietnam, chose when and where to fight, and in the Delta he chose well. Contact came almost always by ambush, from prepared positions on the bank, at close range, opened by the enemy and broken off before supporting fire could be brought to bear. The pattern was the same one that frustrated American infantry across the whole country, reproduced here on the water and intensified by the geometry of the canals. A 1966 assessment of fighting nationwide found the enemy initiated the large majority of engagements, and on the rivers, where a boat's course was predictable and its approach announced by the sound of its engines, that proportion was if anything higher. For the crews, this meant the threat was not a distant exchange of fire, but an ambush at point-blank range, in which the margin between survival and death was often a matter of who fired first and how fast the boats could clear the killing zone. Their only real defenses were speed and the sheer weight of fire they could throw onto the bank in the opening seconds. There was no maneuvering room in a canal 20 meters wide. There was only the volume of return fire and the throttle. The swift boats experienced a parallel transformation. Built for the open coastal waters of market time, they were gradually drawn into the rivers as the campaign pushed inland, operating in conditions their thin aluminium hulls had never been intended to face. A boat designed to chase fishing junks in coastal swells now found itself running narrow rivers where the same close-range ambush that menaced the PBRs awaited it, with even less of the agility the smaller waterjet craft enjoyed. The crews adapted, as crews did throughout the war, but the mismatch between what the equipment had been built for and what it was now asked to do was a recurring theme of the riverine effort. Much of the Brownwater Navy was improvised hardware pressed into a role no one had designed it for, and the men aboard absorbed the difference. The character of the Riverine War changed sharply with the man who took it over. When then Captain Elmo Zumwalt assumed command of U.S. naval forces in Vietnam in 1968, his predecessors had largely confined the patrol boats to the major rivers, treating the smaller canals as too dangerous to enter. The reasoning was understandable. The narrow waterways were where the boats were most exposed, but Zumwalt drew the opposite conclusion. He reasoned that ceding the small canals to the enemy simply guaranteed the enemy would keep them, and that a navy which patrolled only the safe water was conceding the contested water by default. He pushed the boats into the narrow canals and into the long, untouched zones along the Cambodian border, where the enemy had moved with near total freedom. The most ambitious expression of that logic was a series of barrier operations launched in late 1968 under the collective name Sea Lords, in the Navy's fondness for acronyms for Southeast Asia Lake, Ocean, River, and Delta Strategy. The aim was to interdict the enemy's supply routes from Cambodia by establishing patrol barriers along the canals that paralleled the border, choking off the corridors through which weapons and men had been flowing into the Delta unmolested. It was a genuinely aggressive reconception of what the riverine forces were for, shifting them from reactive patrol towards sustained interdiction in the enemy's own backyard. The reasoning was sound, and the operations did disrupt enemy logistics in ways the cautious earlier posture had not. But pushing into the small canals meant pushing into precisely the conditions that most favored ambush. The narrower the waterway, the closer the banks. The closer the banks, the more lethal the encounter, and the less time a crew had to react. The casualty rates told the story without need for commentary. Proportionally, the Brownwater Navy suffered some of the highest loss rates of any American force in the war, and an assignment to the PBRs, or the swift boats, was understood by the men who drew it to be among the most hazardous the Navy had to offer. The aggressiveness that made the campaign operationally effective also made it brutally expensive in the only currency that finally mattered. It is a pattern that recurs throughout the Vietnam War, on land as much as on the water. The tactics that produced results and the tactics that produced casualties were very often the same tactics, and the line between boldness and attrition was thin. The third major element of the Riverine War brought the Army and Navy together into a single striking arm, and represented the most complete integration of land and water combat the conflict produced. The Mobile Riverine Force paired the Army's 9th Infantry Division with Navy Task Force 117, mounting infantry battalions aboard a fleet of converted landing craft so they could be carried directly to the point of contact and supported by gunfire from the water. The concept had a long lineage, from the Union gunboats on the Mississippi during the American Civil War to the French Dinosaurs, the naval assault divisions of the First Indochina War a decade earlier. The Americans had studied the French experience, including its failures, but the version they built was larger, more heavily mechanized, and more lavishly supported than anything that had come before. It operated from a base afloat, a collection of barrack ships, repair vessels and support craft anchored in a river and capable of being repositioned as operations demanded. This mobility was the heart of the concept. Rather than tying the infantry to a fixed installation and the limited radius around it, the floating base let the force pick up and move to a new stretch of river, striking into areas far from any permanent American presence and far from where the enemy expected to be troubled. The workhorse of the force was the armored troop carrier, a landing craft, mechanized of Second World War vintage, sheathed in additional steel armor and fitted with bar armor to detonate rockets before they struck the hull, capable of carrying a platoon of soldiers into battle. Around it operated a family of specialized craft, built or converted for the riverine role. The Monitor, named in conscious echo of the Civil War ironclad, was a heavily armed gunboat mounting a 40mm cannon and, in some versions, a flamethrower, and it served as the floating artillery of the force. The command and communications boat coordinated the operation from the water. The assault support patrol boat, the only member of the family designed from the keel up for the riverine mission rather than converted from an older hull, screened the formation and hunted the enemy's own small craft and mines. Together these vessels amounted to a mechanized amphibious task force capable of delivering and supporting a brigade-sized operation in terrain that had no roads at all. The combination proved effective at bringing combat power directly into areas the enemy had long treated as sanctuary. The Rungsat Special Zone, a dense tidal mangrove swamp southeast of Saigon that guarded the shipping channel to the capital, was one early focus, an area so thick and waterlogged that it had sheltered river pirates long before it sheltered the Viet Cong. The Plain of Reeds, a vast seasonal wetland near the Cambodian border, was another. In these places, the Mobile Riverine Force could insert infantry where the enemy had assumed himself beyond reach, and the effect was as much psychological as tactical. The water had been the enemy's protection. Now it carried his pursuers. A typical riverine operation followed a recognizable rhythm. The boats would move at night or in the pre-dawn dark toward a stretch of river identified through intelligence as harboring enemy units or base areas. The troop carriers loaded with infantry, the monitors and patrol boats arrayed to screen them. At the chosen landing point, the carriers would nose into the bank and drop their ramps, putting the infantry directly into the paddy or the tree line, while the gunboats stood off to deliver fire support and seal the flanks. The infantry would push inland to find and fix the enemy, and the boats would wait to extract them, to reinforce them, or to lift them to a new objective. It was an amphibious assault in miniature, repeated again and again across the delta, and its great advantage was reach. The force could threaten a stretch of river one day and another 50 kilometers away the next, denying the enemy the certainty of where the blow would fall. Mines were a constant hazard throughout. Command detonated charges and floating devices set in the channels, and the assault support boats spent much of their time sweeping ahead of the formation for exactly this threat. The value of all this mobility became undeniable in the last days of January 1968. When the Tet Offensive broke across South Vietnam, the towns of the Delta were among the hardest hit, and several of them, including Mai Tho, Ben Tre, Vinh Long, and Shao Doc, saw heavy fighting as Viet Cong units seized portions of the urban areas in coordinated assaults. The Mobile Riverine Force, able to move quickly along the waterways and concentrate at threatened points, became central to retaking them. A capability conceived for offensive sweeps against rural base areas proved equally suited to the very different work of urban relief, racing infantry and gunfire support to towns that the conventional road-bound reserves could not reach in time. It was in the fighting for one of these towns, Ben Tre, that an American officer was quoted by the journalist Peter Arnett as saying that it had become necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. Whether the words were spoken in exactly that form has been argued over ever since, and the officer's precise meaning was likely narrower than the phrase that escaped him. The line endured regardless of its provenance, because it captured the central contradiction of the entire effort in the Delta. The destruction required to clear the enemy from a populated area sat uneasily against the stated purpose of the war, which was to protect the population from precisely that kind of devastation. Tet was a military defeat for the Viet Cong, who suffered catastrophic losses and failed to hold any of the towns they had seized. It was something closer to a strategic reversal for the United States, and the Delta towns were a small, sharp illustration of why. The Delta was also the proving ground for forces that would become far more famous after the war than during it. The Navy's sea, air, and land teams, the SEALs, conducted much of their early operational work in the canals and mangrove of the Fourth Corps Zone. Operating in small squads, usually at night, they ran ambushes, gathered intelligence, and conducted raids against the local Viet Cong political and military leadership, often in support of the broader Phoenix program aimed at the insurgent infrastructure. Their method was the precise inverse of the patrol boats, where the PBRs moved fast and loud and accepted contact on the enemy's terms. The SEALs moved slowly and silently and dictated the terms themselves, turning the enemy's own preference for ambush and concealment back against him. The enemy reportedly came to call them the men with green faces, after the camouflage paint they wore. The work was small in scale and disproportionate in effect, and it established a model of riverine special operations that would outlive the war by decades. None of this would have functioned without air support, because the boats simply could not carry the volume of firepower their survival demanded. A lightly armored patrol boat caught in a canal ambush had limited ability to suppress a dug-in enemy on its own, and so the Navy created its own helicopter light attack squadron, flying armed Hueys under the call sign Seawolves, specifically to support game warden operations. It became one of the most decorated naval aviation units of the war. When a patrol boat was pinned in a waterway too narrow to maneuver, the Seawolves were frequently the difference between a crew recovered and a crew lost. A fixed-wing partner, the light attack squadron flying the OV-10 Bronco under the name Black Ponies, brought a heavier ordnance load and longer time on station over the contact. Tying these air assets directly to the surface forces was one of the genuine tactical innovations of the campaign, a working admission that the lightly built boats could only survive by borrowing weight from above. The integration was not incidental to the Riverine War. It was a precondition for it. It is worth setting the operational conditions down plainly, because they explain the casualty figures more honestly than any summary can. 4 men aboard a fiberglass boat with no armor worth the name. A canal where the banks stood a few meters off either beam, lined with vegetation that hid everything until it was too late. Contact opened by the enemy, at ranges often under 50 meters, from positions the crew could not identify until the firing began. Gunship support that might arrive within minutes or might be delayed by weather and distance. And the same canals patrolled by day had to be patrolled again by night, when every advantage of concealment passed entirely to the other side. These were not the conditions the Navy had trained its sailors for. The men learned them in the field, under fire, and they learned them at a cost that the loss rates only begin to convey. The question of what all of this accomplished is considerably harder to settle than the question of what it cost. By the measures available at the time, the riverine forces achieved a great deal. Market time effectively closed the sea route, forcing the enemy onto the longer and more vulnerable overland supply lines. Game Warden and Sea Lords contested waterways that had been entirely under enemy control and denied the Viet Cong the free movement along the rivers that had been so central to their strength in the Delta. The Mobile Riverine Force brought sustained combat pressure to base areas that had gone untouched for years. Command statistics credited the riverine forces with thousands of enemy killed and vast quantities of weapons, ammunition, rice, and supplies captured or destroyed. Within the attritional logic that governed American strategy in Vietnam, where progress was measured in enemy losses rather than ground held, these were real and reportable results. Still, the figures do not tell the whole story, and on this point the Delta War faithfully reproduced the war as a whole. The body counts that filled the after-action reports measured activity far more reliably than they measured progress. Captured weapons could be tallied with precision. The political loyalty of the Delta's population, which was the actual prize the entire war was being fought over, could not. The boats could clear a canal, but clearing it and holding it were two very different things. The enemy's capacity to return once the patrol moved on was a permanent feature of the campaign, and a canal swept clean in the morning was contested again by nightfall. This was the central frustration of the whole American effort, reproduced in miniature on the water. The United States could go very nearly anywhere it chose in the Delta, and it could win very nearly every engagement it chose to fight, and yet the underlying control of the population and the countryside remained contested in ways that no patrol barrier could resolve. There is a final irony in how the brownwater Navy came to its end. The entire effort had been improvised at speed, with borrowed and converted boats and invented doctrine, to meet a problem the Navy had not anticipated and was not equipped for. By the time it reached its full effectiveness, around 1968 and 1969, the larger American strategy had already turned toward the exit. Under the policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to hand the war back to South Vietnamese forces, the boats, the bases, and the hard-won tactical knowledge were transferred to the South Vietnamese Navy beginning in 1968 and accelerating sharply thereafter. It was among the largest and fastest such handovers of the entire war, with hundreds of craft passing into South Vietnamese hands in a matter of a few years. Whether the South Vietnamese Navy could sustain the operational tempo the Americans had set was an open question at the time. The American campaign had depended not only on the boats, but on the helicopter gunships, the fixed-wing support, the logistical depth, and the maintenance infrastructure that kept the whole system running. Handing over the hulls was straightforward. Handing over everything that made the hulls effective was not. The answer that arrived after the American withdrawal and the ceasefire of 1973 was not an encouraging one, as the South Vietnamese struggled to maintain the equipment and the operational reach with steadily diminishing support. The brownwater Navy occupies a particular place in the history of the Vietnam War because it was, in a narrow operational sense, one of the parts that actually worked. The coastal barrier did what it had been designed to do. The river patrols and the riverine assault force genuinely contested an environment the enemy had once owned outright. The integration of boats, infantry, helicopters, and special operations teams into a single coherent system was a real achievement, accomplished by an institution improvising well outside its experience and against an enemy thoroughly at home in the terrain. The men who crewed the boats fought under some of the worst conditions and accepted some of the highest risks of the entire war, and they did so with a competence that the record plainly reflects. What the Riverine War could not do was change the equation that governed the conflict as a whole. Controlling the water was necessary. It was never sufficient. The gap between winning every engagement and winning the war, the gap that defined the entire American experience in Vietnam, was nowhere more visible than on the rivers of the Delta, where every canal could be entered and not one of them could finally be kept.